Good afternoon, everyone. Very warm welcome. My name is Manish Sinha, and I'll be your host today. Before we jump into the session, just a quick disclaimer. This session is recorded, and recording may be used for informational, educational, and marketing purposes. And also, today, Prof. Krishnan's remarks are strictly in the capacity of the CME faculty, so just please bear that. All right. So joining us today is Professor Ramayya Krishnan, a distinguished academic and thought leader who has done seminal work at the intersection of technology, policy, and management. He is the Dean of the Heinz College of Information Systems and Public Policy at Carnegie Mellon University, where he has led groundbreaking research on the impact of emerging technologies on society and governance. A serial academic entrepreneur, he has founded 4 externally funded research centers. He's also the faculty director of Block Center of Technology and Society. Professor Krishnan's expertise spans AI governance, information risk management, and digital transformation in the public and private sectors. He's widely recognized for his contributions to policy frameworks that balance innovation with ethical AI practices. And he has been an advisor to governments, international organizations, and industry leaders on the responsible deployment of AI tech. We are thrilled to have Professor Krishnan here amidst us to share his insights from the vantage point of the CME faculty. I'll invite Professor Krishnan to first walk us through a short presentation on the topic AI, policy to practice, and then we can engage in an open dialogue. Over to you, Professor.
Thank you, Don. So thank you, Manish, for this very kind introduction. I want to thank Professor Anand Gopal for inviting me to visit. It's great to be back in Singapore. I come here probably a couple of times a year, and it's really great to come and visit also with other CNU alums like Anand, like Vaiform. So it's really great to be among friends. So thank you again for this opportunity. And I think to just reiterate what Manish said, I serve in a couple of public policy roles for the US government. I chair the AI Futures Working Group of the National AI Advisory Committee. And Manish's point was that, and as I've said, I'm not here on behalf of the US government. I'm not speaking on behalf of the US government. This discussion is entirely in my role as an academic and as a CMU faculty. As Manish noted, my intention is to provide a brief introduction to a set of ideas, to actually seed a conversation and to learn from you as much as have a conversation with you about this topic of both AI as a technology, AI as a technology that needs to be governed, and what the potential implications are for society and business. So with that, thank you. So with that as context, let me get started. Much of what I would say draws not just on my own work, it draws on the work of colleagues at the Block Center for Technology and Society, which is a university-wide center. It was founded, I founded this in 2019, and it's named for Keith Block, who's an alum of the Heinz College, who's a former CEO of Salesforce. And this center has a focus on really trying to understand AI and its implications for society. What are the societal consequences of technological change with a particular focus on AI? And it has 3 major pillars. A pillar on responsible use of AI, a pillar on the future of work, and a pillar on what we call seeding societal futures, which has to do with thinking ahead and asking the question about what the potential consequences are of changes that AI might bring about. And in this work, we recognize that AI is a multidisciplinary enterprise. It's not just computer science, it's not social science, it's really a multidisciplinary enterprise. And therefore, we have 150 faculty from around campus associated with the Block Center. And many of the topics that I will speak about has actually connections with multiple areas at Carnegie Mellon. In addition to the Block Center, we established or just announced the establishment of a brand new center that I will direct. It's joint, it's a cooperative center with the National Institute of Standards and Technology, NIST. And it has a particular focus on measurement and evaluation of frontier AI systems, which is this idea of, how do we, as we think about deploying AI and harnessing it for societal and business value, how do we actually measure it? How do we evaluate it? And how do we think about the potential impacts that AI might have? So that's another topic that we can have a conversation about, which is how do you evaluate models? How do you evaluate systems? Because AI systems are more than just models. It's about people, processes, and models. How do you red team AIs? What does it mean to red team an AI? And then how do you think about impact analysis of AI? So all of these are topics that are, I hope that in addition to the conversation that Manish and I will have, that we will have an opportunity to take questions from you. With that, I thought there were three topics that we thought that I will provide a brief overview of. I have more slides here than I intend to sort of cover each of these in detail, but to give you a high-level sense, the first pillar that I'm going to talk about is where is AI technology headed? The second is going to be a brief primer on AI governance. And then we will talk about AI and its implications for work. Those are the three topics, and then we'll turn this over to Manish to have a conversation. So oftentimes when I present to boards and or to policymakers, especially in the aftermath of ChatGPT being announced late in 2022, I'd often get the question, AI being new. It certainly isn't new because it's been around since the mid-50s. This is a picture from when the term artificial intelligence was coined in Dartmouth. Two of these folks are from Carnegie Mellon, Herb Simon and Alan Noel. So we see ourselves at Carnegie Mellon very much as the birthplace of AI. There's a lot of stuff that's come from Carnegie Mellon that's had a transformative impact on AI. Broadly, there are two kinds of AI. We particularly focus on generative AI in this talk, but many of you, I'm sure, in fact, in the morning, I had conversations with colleagues who were using machine learning, who were using AI to make consequential decisions, to think about resource allocation. So we oftentimes, prior to the advent of generative AI and so-called transformer architecture, there's the idea that you build AIs with a particular purpose in mind. These were what are called narrow AIs built to particular use cases. In contrast, the current excitement about these transformer architecture-based AIs has to do with the fact that you build these models without necessarily any predetermined downstream application in mind. So there's very large amounts of data used for pre-training these models, and then after a fair amount of work in building these models, you can then fine-tune them for the purposes of a particular application. So we particularly focus on broad AI. So what are some trends that we see in technology? There are a few that I want to highlight. But first, I'll just illustrate by way of a set of videos. So this is the first one.
21, a Smart City Institute, which has become a campus-wide initiative that encompasses so much of our work at the intersection of technology and society.
President Farnham Jahanian speaking about Metro 21, which is a university-wide center on smart cities. And here's the...
21, ein Smart City Institute, das zu einer Campus-wide Initiative geworden ist, die so viel unserer Arbeit an der Schnittstelle von Technologie und Gesellschaft heute umfasst, ist ein
talk now in German. The interesting thing is that it's not just that the talk lines have been translated to German. You notice that his lip movements are in sync with German as well, which is interesting.
Smartosti Game User on campus ホワイト、イニシアチブとなり、テクノロジーと社会の
So the interesting thing about these three videos is, in this case, it's innocuous. It's an example of a speech given that's been translated. And one could think of this as actually a very beneficial kind of technology in terms of being able to reach audiences in the language of their preference, their preferred language. But you could easily imagine, and there were a lot of concerns, especially with elections, about potential for misinformation and disinformation, because you need very little content that's out there that's legitimate video content or audio content that then can be used via AI to create new content that sounds like you and can potentially be used with malicious objectives in mind. What are some of those malicious objectives? This is actually from last year in Hong Kong, where you had a bank employee pay out 25 million after there were video calls with who he thought were his bosses instructing him to do this transfer using deepfakes. There's more details to this. We can come back to this if there's interest. Let me see if this will go forward. There. Oops, sorry. So for the younger people in the audience, you should know who this is. Who's this? Drake, right? So this is a well-known music artist who there was a lawsuit filed on account of the fact that his music, you had in effectively a fake being created and then put on a Spotify stream, and question of reputational damage, and concerns related to copyright and intellectual property. I think these are some really important questions that are going to arise here related to, if you look at, related to this technology. If you look at maybe 3 or 4 strikes in the US, the writers' strike, the screen actors' strike, the strike of dock workers, they all relate in some form or the other to AI. Writers, on account of the fact that they were concerned that AI might replace them. Screen actors, on account of the fact that they felt that the studios might be able to create content as in their image, be able to replace them without actually paying them. And dog workers because of robotics. So I think this question about a deep-seated fear about what AI might do for jobs, and we'll talk about this in the discussion on work, I think is certainly very much in the zeitgeist. So one trend is this issue of AI being able to replicate content for good, but at the same time potentially having malicious, could be put to use to with malicious goals in mind, with not very good ability for us to either detect or enforce, because the way deepfakes are created is something called generative adversarial networks. We can talk about what that is, but it makes it very hard to detect content that's been created in this way. The second sort of big change that's happened is multimodal large language models. I mean, we began with text, but if you look at where GPT and Gemini are headed, they're all natively multimodal today. So they can process audio, video, images, and text, allowing you to reason about these as well. This is Sora from OpenAI. This is the ability to create video content autonomously with AI. This is pretty amazing. The only thing that you notice is the physics are a little wrong because the waves are going away from the shore rather than towards the shore, but I'm sure they will get this right in terms of how this technology is evolving. A third trend is the integration of LLMs with traditional software or tools. This is, oftentimes you hear the word agentic systems or agents in AI. So this idea that you could use AI either with very little human intervention or autonomously to actually do trading or maybe place orders for you. For instance, a concrete example is in predictive maintenance, where you're able to predict a part is going to fail and you go ahead and reorder the part so that even prior to failure, you have it in inventory so that you don't have the system that is mission critical, which could be a plane, which could be an elevator, be out of service. This kind of thing being run autonomously is one way an AI could not only do the prediction, but actually do the action as well using a tool. Fourth trend is this capacity to reason with these videos and audio as well, especially with very large context windows. Gemini introduced a 1 million token context window, which would allow for many hours of video to be loaded and then search through. So for instance, you can search for, which part of this video has that particular piece of content, for instance. Now, this kind of thing is really, it's a fun thing to show, but as you can imagine, when you're thinking about, having very large multimodal documents, being able to search those documents really reduces search cost, increases productivity considerably. And if you look at some of the biggest applications of generative AI, it's in something called retrieval augmented generation, or RAG, which uses variants of this technology with text, but you're going to see this come with multimodal technology as well. We've been using the word large language model because that's often what you hear about, because these models having very large number of parameters, but you're having the emergence of small language models, particularly the open source models from Microsoft, OpenAI, and from Google are exceedingly good. And you could imagine a world where you not only have large language models that serve the purposes that you hear about, but also specialized small language models for specific tasks that more than meet the needs of that with a better cost-benefit ratio than maybe a large language model. So the economics of this are going to matter as well. And then finally, you've been hearing about Model 01 from OpenAI. Google just released Gemini Flash Thinking on December 15th, 2024. This emergence of models that can reason. So oftentimes this is cast in the Kahneman and Tversky System 1, System 2 type of thinking, that traditional LLMs do System 1, as in fast retrieval, but they're not particularly good at reasoning. Now you're getting the emergence of System 2 models that can actually reason in a more explicit way through something called chain of thought and tree of thought, which we can talk about more detail if you're interested. One of the interesting projects we have just begun to look at is how do these models, particularly for consequential decision-making tasks, Gemini Flash Thinking actually tells you about the thinking it's undertaking as it's responding to a question. Does that actually increase trust in an LLM? So if I told you, this is my reasoning process to arrive at such and such recommendation, does that help you evaluate that better and then say, okay, I get it, I think I understand it, therefore I believe you, is an interesting question. So Model 01 and Model 03 from OpenAI, they give you an answer, but they don't tell you the process they went through. Flash Thinking actually tells you about the process they went through. So I think these are all some of the trends that I think are worth keeping on top of. A number of business applications have emerged, many of which you probably are aware of. In addition to supply chain management, customer service, there's big things happening in software engineering, software development as well. The co-pilots that have emerged for these different topics are really important. And there the question is, what are the implications for augmenting human workers versus substituting human workers, which we'll come to when we talk about AI and the future of work. All right, so that's a quick summary of some trends. Let's very quickly talk about AI governance. These are the kinds of questions policymakers in multiple jurisdictions, including in Singapore, where I've been very honored to work with some of your policymakers at NDDI and IMDA. These questions relate to what happened in prior generations with social media. We did not intervene and let the technology play itself out. It has had some deleterious consequences that are now being recognized. Therefore, there's been a lot of concern, particularly among a subset of policymakers and in society, as to whether should they continue doing this business of letting industry move fast, break things, and then we fix things later, or should we be much more deliberate this time around? Can we balance innovation with regulation? This is the age-old question of what's the right balance. So these are some of the questions that arise, and as you see the last one, how do we best support workers and firms navigate the future of work? I think that becomes a really important question. There are three broad framing questions related to approaches to AI governance. The first one relates to a market-based approach. Historically, the US has been oriented that way. The European Union has been very much human rights focused, and China has had more of a states' rights-based approach. Now, certainly it's the case that the US certainly cares about human rights and states' rights. It's not that they don't care. It's a question of where the emphasis lies. So in Europe, the emphasis has historically been on human rights, less so on these other things. So much of everything that you see, be it the EU AI Act or the exec orders in the US, so it's an interesting question of what's going to happen to Biden's exec order in a couple of weeks when the President Trump taking office. But it's interesting to look at the December 19th exec order that President Trump signed and the December 23 exec and the October 23 exec order that President Biden signed. Lots of commonalities across these in terms of high-level themes. There are some differences in execution and focus, which I suspect we place about. And the details of this I'm going to leave to the discussion, but it's really important to think of governance not just in terms of at one stage of the AI life cycle or another. It's throughout the life cycle, from pre-deployment to post-deployment to continuous monitoring. You would ideally like the capacity for people who, when they do procurement, because most businesses and governments don't build their own AI, they procure AI. So when they procure AI, what information do they need? Should there be nutrition labels, much like when you go buy Coke or when you buy a pizza, you're told, what are the different ingredients that went into it? What is it that, what is the equivalent thereof with AI? Certainly there are model cards and data cards and system cards that provide high-level overviews of what are in the AI, but there are questions about, is that detailed enough to provide the kind of information that a purchaser or procurer needs? The ONBM memo is really instructive to read in this regard. Should there be an underwriter's lab that does an independent evaluation and evaluates AIs and provides data on how reliable they are, how trustworthy they are, how much having sandboxes to evaluate them, so that those then become ways in which procurers can decide how to procure AIs. And then, of course, there is the monitoring of the AI, because unlike in software, where you could procure and then deploy and not worry about it, these things are going to evolve, and therefore you need to sort of continuously monitor them throughout their life cycle. So I think these are really important questions. There are lots of interesting aspects to discuss here. One thing I'll leave you with is, much like in cybersecurity, you've had the evolution of computer emergency response teams and reporting of vulnerabilities that you encounter in software to try and address them. It's a public-private partnership. I could equally imagine AI-related certs that actually report AI vulnerabilities and failures. And then the interesting question is, what should be the mechanisms whereby the vendors are actually going to act on fixing these vulnerabilities, which is challenging, because it's not easy to just fix or patch an AI vulnerability, especially when you have to retrain a model, and it's expensive to do so. So we'll come back to this. So the last pillar that I want to talk about before I turn this back over to Manish is on AI and the future of work. So I'll start with saying we've been through multiple types of technological change and revolution. Many of you who are older will remember the advent of automated teller machines, at which point were the predictions made that bank tellers would no longer exist, because you now have a way of automatically debiting and crediting accounts. As it turns out, you now have more bank tellers than existed when ATMs were introduced, but the skill sets they have and the kind of work that they do has evolved. and it's changed. Even though the label is the same, what they do has changed. And therefore, an interesting question is, are we going to see what happened with bank tellers? Or if you've been in the States or in other countries where they have, toll collectors on highways, they don't exist anymore because you can completely substitute the work that they do by reading license plates or using an EC tag. You have those kinds of tags here to allow for people to get charged prices for going around in the city, entirely done digitally. You don't need people to actually give you a card, right? Those jobs went away. So some cases, technology substitutes out the job. In other cases, it's augmenting or it's changed the skill set that is required. What's likely going to happen? So you also have these, this is work actually by a colleague, Daniel Rock at the University of Pennsylvania, who's done this work with OpenAI, where they talk about 80% of the US workforce would have at least 10% of their work being affected or being exposed. So what does it mean to be exposed? Does it actually mean augmented, substituted? So these are all interesting open questions. And I think it's insufficient just to look at an AI exposure score. So we can talk some more about what does these exposure scores mean and what that then implies for the type of reskilling, upskilling. It's often a term you hear bandied about with regard to how do we best prepare our workers to have the right skill sets that the economy might demand. And how do we incent them appropriately depending on whether you're 25 years old or whether you're 60 years old? And who's going to pay for it? Is it the worker themselves? Is it the firm? Is it the government or some combination thereof? Singapore has some really interesting ideas in this regard. Two things I'll leave you with. One is a study from two colleagues, Noy and Zhang, who did a randomized controlled trial deploying Gen AI, actually ChatGPT, versus Overleaf to a set of subjects to see how generative AI, whether it made a difference or not to writing based on conditioning on skill. And it turns out the short answer is across all skill levels, you're seeing a move to the right in terms of quality and a move to the left in terms of the time required to perform the task. So net, all good. More benefit to people with low skills than to people with higher skills. Writing is broken down to 3 subtasks: ideation, editing, and final proofing. Turns out that depending on your skill, you tend to use the technology differently. Whether you use it for ideation or whether you use it for rough draft. The other piece of work that might be useful to highlight is the work that was just published that was on AI and science, where there's a deployment of a specialized large language model in a material science lab where they show that material scientists who are expert are gaining considerably more from the use of the AI than from people who are not as technically proficient, because the AI generates a whole bunch of hypotheses. Knowing being skilled allows you to pursue just those hypotheses that end up being fruitful, thereby yielding a big productivity benefit. If you're not so skilled, it's not just the AI, you can't pursue every hypothesis that the AI generates. You need to have judgment to decide which one to pursue, which is a very different kind of implication than the AI and writing experiment, where everybody benefited. The AI and science thing says you benefit if you are skilled. So this question of what kind of skilling you're going to have to provide and how, as a government, as a firm, you need to have an observatory to try and understand and gain situational awareness of what the labor market is demanding, is where our thinking is and our advice giving has been to government about AI and the future of work. So with that, let me turn this back to Manish. Thanks once again for your attention.
That was super insightful, Prof. Krishnan. Obviously, that must have led to a lot of questions on everybody's minds. So let me just forward this to this page here. You can actually scan the QR code and submit your questions, and it will automatically show up on my iPad here. I can post that to Prof. In the meantime, maybe I can just get questions from my side, jump started. So, Prof. Krishnan, I want to focus on the last pillar on future of work, right? Technology has always seemed to be posed as a threat to take jobs away, but while it has disrupted, it has created new jobs. And we don't know exactly where AI, the jury's out there, but what's your view in terms of the displacement versus creation of jobs and the pace of it at which it's happening?
So thank you, Manish. I think these are exactly the kinds of right questions to ask. I think if you look back in time, it's certainly the case that along with every technological change, there have been certainly sets of workers that have been affected, but new jobs having been created. This goes back to the switch from steam as the driver of provider of energy to electricity, to multiple examples with regard to the advent of agricultural technology, for instance, that considerably increased the productivity of agricultural workers, but reduced the need for as many workers in agriculture. They moved to other sectors. So I think if you ask my personal view is that I do believe that you will see certain types of tasks being substituted out, certain kinds of tasks being augmented, entirely new occupations emerging, and some occupations being substituted out entirely. So in other words, very much along the same lines of what we've seen before. The interesting and open question is what's the pace at which this might happen? Because I think in the past, when you have had significant barriers or investments that had to be made to build a plant, etc., before you could deploy a technology. Here, the technology is purely digital. So the question is, would there be a greater rate at which this might have an impact? And I think the National Academy has just published a report. In fact, it was published by my two Block Center colleagues, Tom Mitchell, who's the chief technologist of the Block Center, was a CMU faculty member, and Eric Renolson, who is on the advisory board of the Block Center, who's known to many of us. And they basically said there's a divergence of opinion as to the pace and rate of change among experts. So the first question is, that's a professional way of saying I don't know. So don't know quite the pace at which this might actually happen. The second, I think, interesting point, though, is I do think that this idea of gaining situational awareness of what is going to actually happen, this is absolutely essential. And most firms, and certainly most governments, their administrative systems, data systems, have not been engineered to gain this kind of fast situational awareness of what's going on. So LinkedIn and Indeed and Monster.com have a much quicker grasp of what's going on in the labor market. So I think we need a public-private partnership between the private and the public sector to get a much better understanding of what's actually happening. And that should feed in to this process of figuring out where are we seeing increased demands as measured by resumes and as measured by job descriptions being posted, so that you can have faster responses that are possible. Now, you also need to have some kind of wage insurance, some kind of safety net that would allow workers to navigate and move from, because you can't change on a dime. So I think you do need to invest society-wide in acquiring new skills. But with skills, how do you provide people with the right information so that they can decide what is it that's best aligned with their interests close enough to what they think they already have by way of a skill, where there is likely going to be a demand. These are all questions about what kinds of systems do we need to create that will provide the right set of information to policymakers, to business leaders, to workers. And I think that's work to be done. I don't think we have any.
Have systems in place to observe change
and actually act on it.
Be able to react to it.
That's right. And be able to act on it and help with appropriate decision support. Beyond just the situational awareness, what's the decision support for workers, for firms, for policymakers?
I love the example that you gave of one example of the teller, ATM teller, and these you juxtaposed it with the toll booth. Now, I also reference your paper where you break down a task, and you talk about the structure of a task. And when you analyze the structure of a task, certain tasks are more prone to be displaced by Gen AI and so on and so forth. So with those examples in mind, are there certain kinds of jobs or tasks that are more prone to be basically taken away by Gen AI and some that are more resilient? Is there a way to kind of demarcate that?
So I think a first cut is that exposure score. Yeah. And those exposure scores come about really by asking a Gen AI, can you perform this particular task at a particular skill level? And I think where that comes from is the Bureau of Labor Statistics in the US, and I'm sure there's a Singapore version of this, has created a database called ONET. ONET has 873 occupations. It's a list of all the occupations in the United States in the labor market. Each of the occupations has a vector of tasks and a vector of skills required to perform that task, and very detailed data about what tasks occur, how frequently. Like we file taxes how often? Once a year. But other things we do multiple times a day. Some of these tasks require a set of skills. Some skills are required at a very high level of proficiency, others less so. So think of this as being a very detailed map, if you will, of what an occupation consists of. And you have companies like Burning Glass, for instance, that have even more detailed versions of these things. So if you now look at, as AI develops, you can now say, does it have the skill at the right level of proficiency to perform that task reliably enough? Then you can ask the question, how often is that task performed? And at the current situation, what are the economics of it in terms of cost and benefit? So you could ask the same question for what would be the cost and benefit of actually deploying the AI. Yeah. Then you can ask questions socially. Are the social norms such that you want the AI to be able to do it, or would you want a person or a person in the loop to be able to do it? So I think rather than answer this as these are the occupations that are resilient and those are the ones that are likely, I'd like us to think about this in a data-driven way and come up with an approach to thinking about how one might go about this. And, these things are not cast in stone. The economics may change. The data about social norms may change. So toll collectors, we've all gotten used to now easy tags, or if you don't have an easy tag, getting an invoice in the mail based on your license tag having been read, that this is what you owe for having used the highway, right? So I think these are things, the question is at what pace will these things happen? And to some extent, I think policy will have a lot to do with this as well. That is, the decision about what sets of tasks we will allow just the market to figure this out. But we are already seeing that with Copilot, with software engineering. We're already seeing it with customer service. But would you want that with healthcare? Perhaps not. I mean, there's going to be a role for policy in those things. So I think it's not a nay or a one size fits all answer.
But I guess you pointed out to some characteristics being related to frequency of the stress,
frequency, cost benefit,
the complexity,
and social norms. And policy taking that into account to deciding whether it's okay to deploy.
Let me take a question from the audience here, which is more not broad based on the job market, but specific to what do you think are the job opportunities in the field of AI governance and the skills needed?
I think there are a number of opportunities in this area. In particular, I think this issue of AI evaluation. You know, again, my expertise and experience is limited to the US. So I'll use a US example. So when the Securities and Exchange Commission began making requirements, you know, FASB that was created, that led to the requirement for publicly traded firms to have their financial statements having to be audited. Right? That then resulted in a whole industry around auditing, if you will. The PwCs, the Deloittes, the Andersons of old, they're all E&Y. You know, that whole sector came about. And what was it designed to do? It was designed to sort of provide trust in our financial system, to make sure that publicly traded firms, you could trust the 10Ks, the annual reports that these firms are putting out, right? So is there an equivalent thereof where you could imagine that, especially in consequence, right now Netflix makes recommendations using AI tools. If it screws up and suggests a show that you shouldn't be watching, big deal, not a big problem. But if you're going to use AI in consequential decision-making tasks, what is the kind of, I'll use the word auditing advisedly, but what is the evaluation that needs to have been conducted? Who's going to do the conducting? Who's going to do the certifying to say that it's A-okay to deploy it? This could be in consequential financial trading. It could be in healthcare. It could be in things related to maintenance and other such things that have the lives of people are at stake. It's interesting to see how autonomous vehicles, or the way Tesla has introduced this technology with no regulation.
Yeah.
Right. So, and we've had some examples of errors being caused by the technology, though they do have that caveat saying that you always are supposed to maintain your hands on the wheel, but people do sort of begin to think that technology is bulletproof, and that's resulted in a few people dying, right? So you could imagine that kind of, just like we have crash tests, should there be the equivalent of this being done for AIs for particular and consequential kinds of domains? Who's going to do it? So I think there is a combination of the measurement, the evaluation types of skill sets, and that would be relevant. I'd say that's one. The second, I think, is the kind of job that has become in both in the private and the public sector relevant in cybersecurity, is red teaming. This idea of being able to, before I deploy a system, to try and identify what the vulnerabilities are. At the present time, red teaming, is a cool word to use, but this issue of what's the science of red teaming, what exactly does it entail, how might we actually train and educate people and certify them to be able to conduct red teaming well, and by having done red teaming, are we able to then certify these systems having met some kind of bar? I mean, these are all, so I think these are some concrete examples. I think we've always had in social science this idea of evaluating programs and systems for impact. So for instance, if you're going to deploy a credit granting or a loan granting system using AI versus one that didn't use AI, what is the impact of those systems on who got the loan, who didn't get the loan? That's an example of an evaluation question. You could evaluate them. I think we have faculty here who are doing work on healthcare, AI, and evaluation. So I think these are all skill sets that are required at different stages of the pipeline, both in creating the AIs, but also sort of evaluating them to see if they're ready for deployment in a responsible and trustworthy
manner. That's encouraging, because these are all new areas of skills required and new deployment. So it's potentially a source of job.
But it's also building on things that we do know something about.
Absolutely. One last question on the future of work, but this is linked to the education vertical. So this question from the audience is, what's some observable AI impact for education, faculty mainly? And if there are specific examples from CMU, that'll be even better.
So I'd love to hear from you all as to what you're seeing. Like everybody else at Carnegie Mellon, when ChatGPT was released in late 22, early spring 23, we constituted school-wide and then university-wide committees to try and understand what are the implications of this for education. And if you took a step back, I think it's really important to ask ourselves, what exactly do we want to achieve? What's the objective in education, right? We want to ensure people have the capacity to be good critical thinkers, be able to, engage in good evidence-based argumentation. These are all core skill sets. And I think you want this in the presence of AI, as well as without in the absence of AI. So the first order response from most folks, most colleagues, both at CMU and elsewhere, as ChatGPT or Gemini is going to increase academic integrity incidents. People are just going to use this to submit, their essays or other such things. This is like the first order reaction. Or programs are going to be written using Copilot, and so people began writing in their course syllabi very detailed instructions about when to use AI, when not to use AI. Of course, you need clarity around how to instruct students. But I'd like us to take a step back and ask ourselves, what's the overall objective of what it is we are trying to achieve by way of education? Where does AI make the most sense? And how do we incorporate it in ways where we still are able to deliver on our learning objectives, while still enabling our students to get the benefit of, if there is productivity enhancement or innovation that they can gain, they can do that. But we shouldn't sort of lose sight of the larger learning objectives that we have. So that's sort of this high-level statement. What we're doing at CMU is the provost as well as the deans have created a source of funding that we call it GAITAR for its sort of use of AI. So grants in aid of AI for teaching as research. It's GAITAR. And this idea is that you can get a grant to sort of say, I'm teaching history, or I'm teaching software engineering, or I'm teaching some other type design course. How am I going to use AI in an innovative way so that we can create a community so that we can learn from one another? So we've done this at the school level at Heinz, but we've also had this going on at the college level.
So has CMU migrated to some kind of a common platform that's AI-driven for faculty and students?
So we certainly have made available a platform that Azure offers a platform for OpenAI that is hosted via VPN. It's not the public version of ChatGPT, but rather it's a version that is hosted off a VPN, which means that the interaction with GPT is not public, because there are concerns about private information being revealed, that kind of thing. You also are making available some of this technology as infrastructure to support research. And I think this is the bigger issue, because I think there's an education issue.
Yeah.
I think one of our biggest concerns, I guess, is that I think as universities, and I include you all in this, is that so much of what is required to do AI innovation requires so much compute and data that universities don't have that infrastructure. So this capacity to have that infrastructure to support our faculty doing AI innovation is really important. So there's education. So I think we are very much learning about how we're going to address this. I think, like I said, there are a number of, as with almost any new technological change, some faculty have they dive right in, and they're leaders, and others want to, it's like the penguin problem, right? So it's like the first penguins are already in there, the others want to wait and watch and learn, and I think that's going to happen. But I think the program that the provost has put together, the GUIDAR program, is a great program. I think each school has got these multiple seeded innovations going on. And I think we will learn. But I think the important thing to keep in mind is not just be purely tactical about this, but keep in mind what the overall learning objectives are that we want to achieve.
I want to shift gears to regulation and AI governance. There are quite a few questions here. So maybe I'll try to bucket them. I guess one of the challenges is that AI is moving at such a fast pace that we basically debate about whether they should be self-regulated by corporates or there should be a more proactive regulation by the government, right? In fact, one of the audience members has made a very interesting comment saying Alan Greenspan characterizes Ruth as that of a janitor, clean up the mess after things break, which is basically being more reactive, right? Just come in post facto. So where do you think, the right answer lies in terms of relying on self-regulation or governments becoming far more active in terms of figuring out where it's headed or fixing it later?
Yeah, so this is sort of then the huge challenge, I think, which is if you took social media as an example, right, it certainly evolved with very much of a hands-off attitude. The view was it was all motherhood and apple pie in terms of it being awesome. But what we did find out was that there are addiction problems, there are mental health issues, screen time is a huge issue, especially young girls and body image. There are lots of concerns that this is exacerbating that problem. And all of this has been the view now that we're waking up to something that we hadn't thought about earlier. Now, that in some sense has resulted in people saying, hey, should we have a repetition of this? But on the other hand, the concern is this technology is moving so rapidly. How do you regulate something that you don't fully have a handle on because it's moving so fast? That's the response on the other side. And my sense is that the divide that you see in the discussions that you read about among policymakers comes from those three broad framing point I made about, is it market innovation that's driving your policy making primarily? Is it human rights? Is it states' rights? So it's not the case that you don't care about human rights or states' rights. The question of where do you place the emphasis and at what point in time. So to your question about I can tell you what I think will likely happen. Where we certainly seem in the US, it certainly seems to be the case that just by virtue of the fact that we have federal, state, and local. Unlike in Singapore, there is one authority that makes the decision for everybody. I expect that there will be a patchwork. I mean, California and New York may do something. In fact, California has a privacy policy like GDPR. You don't have a federal privacy policy. So I expect that you'll see some version of this as in, because the federal government are unlikely to come in with a strong hand on regulation, I suspect that the states might respond. New York City has an algorithmic accountability regulation. So you could see a patchwork of these things. And then what are the implications of the EU AI Act? By virtue of them being a large economy, most firms are going to sort of say, if I'm going to sell into the EU, I'm going to have to comply. So just like GDPR became de facto the regulation, it might end up where firms may comply with what the EU is requiring. And this goes back to this issue of what might happen with regard to trade across jurisdictional boundaries. We're in for some interesting times, I think. But it might be the case that you're seeing the US being being perhaps more market focused and the Europeans being more human rights and regulation focused. And that might actually be an equilibrium, much like what happened with privacy. So effectively, large firms complied with the EU. Now, the question is, what happens to the small and medium-sized firms? This is a good equilibrium to have. So there are lots of open questions about this model that we are talking about.
So do you think EU with its human rights-led approach basically remains behind in terms of innovation?
So this is actually, we were in Geneva talking to people who were working on the EU AI Act last year, and this was the concern that was being expressed, that if you take account of who are the leaders in AI, the US certainly has the leading number of firms, and then China has a couple of firms that are doing very well. DeepSeek and Quen, in addition to the US firms. And then you have Falcon from Abu Dhabi, which is the Middle East, and then you have Mistral, the only European entrant, but they have a very large investment from Microsoft. So, so there's this concern that are we falling behind? And the last version of the EU AI Act, certainly there was a pullback in terms of what the requirements were going to be, because they wanted to make sure that there was a European led innovation opportunity as well. So it's not entirely clear, these are the criteria under which you will see innovation happen. And if you do this, then you won't see innovation happen. So I don't want to give the wrong impression that what the EU is doing is somehow hurting innovation. But I can say that it's very much as a concern.
Okay, the good news is I got lots of questions. The bad news is I got 5 minutes left or less. So I think I'll have to wrap it up with two quick ones. One is in your papers and in the context of the different regions, you talked about the developer states and the deployer states, which developer states being primarily US or China, which is ahead in terms of foundational models, and then the deployer states, which are actually putting that to use for specific applications. In that context, where do you think Singapore stands, and what could we do uniquely here in Singapore as far as regulation goes?
So I think Singapore has huge opportunity, certainly in deployment, but also has an opportunity in development for the Southeast Asian market for the reasons that you're all well aware of, just by virtue of where it's at and at the crossroads of all these different cultures. I think the sets of skill sets that you need for deployment are things really related to how do you bring together people, process, and technology to actually get value out of something. Just because it's something cool and fancy in AI, it doesn't change that equation. That still remains. I think the interesting question is, do you need enough by way of deep knowledge about what's earlier in the further up in the value chain? What's the right blend of foundation model skill sets and deployment skill sets versus just having downstream deployment skill sets? That's the important question.
And we need more of the skill set on the upstream, the foundation.
You need what's the right percentage? I can't tell you, but I think you need a combination.
Maybe one final question, Prof. Krishnan, from my side is, if you look 10 to 20 years ahead, how do you envision the ideal relationship between humans and technology?
But first of all, you should never predict something, leave alone 20 years and forget it. But you certainly, even if you go back 15 years, right? So when did the first iPhone was 08, 09, okay? And we look at where we're at now in 2024, 16 years on. Do you talk to your phone? We certainly do. Whether it's Siri or Alexa or pick your favorite AI assistant. Do you drive? I'll confess, I find that I need GPS to get around. I used to be able to get around without GPS. I need GPS to get around. So in other words, it's already becoming so much a part and parcel of our lives. So when you say humans and AI 20 years hence, I mean, look at us today. I think we underestimate the extent to which it's already become, from Amazon recommendations to Netflix to Siri to Alexa to GPS. It's already a lot going on, and we interact constantly with tech that's making recommendations, making offers to us. Now, you could argue that those are all narrow AIs, or some combination of analytics and AI. Gen AI is going to just add to that list. It's just going to be combined, where you're going to see content being created. You're going to see, in particular, combinations of generative AI and predictive AI being used. But at the end of the day, most people don't care about what lies under the hood. They think in terms of, can I talk to my phone? Can I get from here to there? How it actually happens, that's under the hood. So I think the relationship between humans and AI already is quite a ways down that journey. I don't think, so I take issue with your question about 20 years from now.
No worries. Okay, on that note, I know we couldn't go through all the questions that were there, but Prof will furnish those questions to you offline, and hopefully you can get back to the audience on some of your thoughts there as well. I think with that, we come to a conclusion. I would like to really thank you for the time you've taken today. It was super insightful. I learned a lot. Hope you all learned too as well.
Thank you again for your